Okay, John. So for economists such as ourselves, this week has been something of a bumper week for economic statistics on the local economy. We had at the start of the week we had the Ulster Bank Purchasing Managers Index. We then had in the middle of the week we then had the Q2, the second quarter figures for the index of production, which is mostly manufacturing, and also index of services. And indeed, we also then had a raft of labour market data as well. So in terms of just looking at some of those and beginning with the index of production, which is mostly manufacturing, we saw big falls reported of 2% quarterly decline in the latest quarter, but we're still up year on year, well above that of the UK. Sort of what are your thoughts about how the local manufacturing sector is faring at the minute?
I'm not worried so much about the future for the manufacturing sector. I think we've seen them being quite buoyant over the last 3 or 4 years, more buoyant than what's been happening in the United Kingdom. And what's happening at the moment may be a temporary wobble. But let's not get away from the fact that manufacturing takes you straight away into exports. And in terms of exporting, we've got the problem of the competitiveness value of the sterling. And sterling has been appreciating, which makes exporting more difficult. So that the present position for manufacturing is they're holding their own, I think, when you average out recent quarters, but they're holding their own, I think, with difficulty. And then when you begin to look what lies behind it, their employment figures are pretty stable. But when you take the employment and look at the level of output, the productivity of the manufacturing sector is not very encouraging. It has been very static. And of course, that takes you on to a big national issue. Productivity for Northern Ireland and for the United Kingdom is now a weak spot in a situation where we're looking for economies to grow.
Indeed, and in terms of just going through some of those figures again in the latest Q2 report, I suppose one of the things people might be afraid in terms of it, are we seeing that like a slowdown coming through, that we're seeing big falls in the second quarter. However, we have to remember that the first quarter we saw freak increases in growth in the manufacturing sector, and that was largely due to the engineering sector, and within that it was transport equipment, and so that would have been probably big exposure to the likes of Bombardier, which saw huge increases. So actually, if you strip out the first quarter and look at the fourth quarter versus the second quarter, it's still showing strong growth, which is encouraging that at least until the middle of this year, manufacturing sector was faring pretty well.
We're both drawing the same conclusion, that manufacturing sector has been doing reasonably well. I'm not sure that I would go with your description of a freak quarter's growth, but nevertheless, let's settle for the fact that it was unusually large, and we don't obviously know which firms caused it. And you rightly point at the big engineering firms, mainly probably Bombardier was contributing to it. Now, whatever method they used for measuring their output, it had come in a way in which it made the first quarter look rather better, and now the second quarter not looking so good. But we will live through that. The underlying trend is there. I'm not so worried that the Northern Ireland manufacturing sector has been behaving quite steadily in terms of maintaining its output, maintaining its employment. I would like it to do better. I would like us to be able to be saying, and when you look at the productivity figures, it has been improving. And sadly, that's not so. Now, the downside of that is, if the situation is that we've kept the employment up, we seem to have preserved employment at the price which was we hadn't been pushing for efficiency and innovation and productivity. And I think that fits more than just the manufacturing sector. I think it fits the whole economy. We actually have in Northern Ireland maintained employment in recent couple of years at a level which is higher than we might have expected, but at the price of earnings have been going down, real earnings, and output per person has not been going up. So do you want a picture which says, thank goodness we've kept the number of jobs? Or do you want me to say, well, unfortunately, we've kept the number of jobs in a way in which it may not be so sustainable because they're not earning their keep in a way in which would add to the profitability. of the businesses. And that does give me a cause for concern.
And indeed, in terms of productivity, was the number one issue as far as the Labour government was concerned when they came into power back in 1997, and we saw that through the decade that followed, where it was the focus on productivity, the productivity drivers, innovation, enterprise, skills, investment, etc. And productivity is basically being forgotten about during this whole downturn. But would you expect to see it to make another return where there's going to be a big government focus back on the productivity agenda?
There's certainly going to be a government focus at a UK-wide level, and that raises the question, okay, and what would it mean for the devolved institutions? I'll come back to that. But at a UK level, there's going to be a focus on productivity, getting it up. George Osborne has been taking a lot of credit, and indeed the government has, for the fact that Britain's unemployment has been falling, and ours has as well. But that fall in unemployment has not been associated with higher output per person. So there's an inconsistency, and that should be a worry both sitting in London and sitting in Belfast. Now, come back to the Northern Ireland situation. There is a tension here for the executive, if we get the executive back ever, and maybe we'll come back to that. But the tension for the executive is, are they prepared now to talk the language of saying it is probably more important that we improve our productivity and our efficiency than it is that we protect jobs to the point where protecting those jobs is making the future of those firms rather less secure? And I think there is a trade-off, and we haven't really begun to recognise the problem.
Because we're sort of seeing that in terms of, while the manufacturing performance has been good up until the middle of this year, we're well aware of what's happened over the last few months. And while particularly last month we've had this roller coaster on the global equity markets linked to China, but beyond equity markets, what we have seen is, in terms of a lot of the manufacturing PMIs around the world, most of them are coming in showing a slowdown in manufacturing activity in August relative to July. We've had global trade is now growing at its slowest rate since 2009, which was when we had the last global downturn. We've had the US trade with the rest of the world shrank in the first 7 months of this year. Canada's in recession, Brazil's in recession, Russia's in recession. So clearly there's a lot of signs that it's not just a Chinese equities bubble. There is some tangible signs of a global economic slowdown.
Right on both counts, I think. First of all, the Chinese equity bubble. That was a very severe kick to the world markets, and we are not immune to that. We may not trade so much with China directly, but we are influenced by all other firms. So the Chinese equity bubble, shall we say, it was prodded or burst. But the net result, I remember thinking that the evening which that was at its worst, and it hasn't recovered very much, I was thinking, by and large, that's my pension fund savings down by £2,000 or £3,000 in the space of one day. Now, there must be many other people in Northern Ireland for whom that was symbolic of what was happening to pension funds or to money saved for investment. So the Chinese bubble was important. But as you rightly say, if you look around and you say, they're not on their own, things have been looking a bit worse elsewhere. And the shorthand phrase that I now read with some interest and worry is, are we now actually already heading into the next recession? If the rest of the world is taking us down slightly, and Britain is not doing terribly well, partly for the unusual reason heading towards recession, but the pound is overvalued. Now, those two, it's a pity you have both at the same time. But if that's the true state of things, then I think we've got a lot to worry about. Northern Ireland is just as vulnerable to the fact we could already be past the best in terms of the recovery, and we could be heading into a period, I hope it's short, but it might not just months. We're heading into a period when we should be talking about how vulnerable is Northern Ireland now to the spillover effects from recession elsewhere, and the creation of recession by ourselves, in terms of what are we doing to confidence in terms of consumer spending in Northern Ireland? What are we doing to family in terms of their savings and their behaviour? because of what's happening in the political world. I'm quite happy to link the instability in the political world to the possible consequences for the economy. And indeed, I would argue that in Northern Ireland we have, and I'm maybe as guilty as anybody else, trying to say now this is a plea of guilty, now I want to put it right. Over the time, I've always thought, well, the political problems will go up and down, and they'll get an answer. I think I now have to say the political problems go up and they're down seriously, and they're down to the point where if I were many of the ordinary families in Northern Ireland, I would feel less secure about my future income. I would feel less confident about living in Northern Ireland. And you only have to have a small amount of that pessimism for consumer spending to take a hit. And if consumer spending takes a hit, that will work its way back through the economy. And this, I think, takes us to the point where you compare what's been happening to manufacturing, where we're not too depressed, but there are worries. But when we look at what's happening to distribution, retailing spending, I'm not surprised now when the worry is that retail spending is likely to be down in real terms. We've seen it in some of the measures of footfall in the high street. The footfall measures have not been improving the way we would.
New car sales as well, which
and
is
new
a
car
key
sales.
barometer.
Yes.
It's pretty much been flat for
Yes.
the first 7-8 months of the year.
Some of the evidence that's being used to say we may be wrong in reaching that conclusion is, but house prices are improving. I'm not surprised that house prices are improving because we've come away from an enormously distorted housing market. We're now into a housing market where the volume of housing sales is picking up, but the amount of house building has not yet picked up. There's a series of contradictory pressures in the housing market. And until we get the pressure that says it's worthwhile builders building more houses, we'll have house prices adjusting possibly rather more than the cost of living, which is what's being forecast now day by day.
I think you made an important point where you were talking about then the whole idea of a global recession, or maybe not a global recession, a global downturn. And I think, it's important to remember that the economy goes in cycles, and the same way as there's a political cycle, there's an economic cycle. Even though we had Gordon Brown had been associated with the term about the end of boom and bust in terms of a Tory boom and bust, but I think that's an important point because 2009 was whenever we had the global downturn and the start of a recovery. So the recovery is now 6 years old. And it would be very optimistic if you were to sort of think in the next 2 years we weren't to see another downturn, because that's on average in terms of when you would see recessions in the likes of the US or whatever. This time round, the US is probably the strongest economy. It was the source of the last global downturn, whereas now the focus is on China. And I suppose one of the things is that people think in terms of with the Northern Ireland economy, but we don't trade much with China, but I think the issue is it's how China is linked to the rest of the world. Slowdown in China feeds around the world in terms of, and we've seen that in the commodity markets, we've seen that in terms of oil prices. And while a lot of the consumers in Northern Ireland and households are probably welcoming the fact that every time they drive past the petrol forecourt these days, they can see a further reduction in petrol prices. But the consequences of that are also in terms of, will that feed through in terms of manufacturing slowdown at home as well as abroad? So what impact do you think global downturn, how that will be felt in Northern Ireland?
I suspect that far from being immune, we will be just as vulnerable to a global downturn as any other region of Western Europe. And I thought you made the interesting point. We now are 6 years into what was the recovery process. And recoveries don't usually last. They never last forever. Economies always reach the bottom or the top. And what we're talking about now is, right, we've had 6 years when we've been climbing. Northern Ireland has been climbing rather more slowly than Great Britain, but nevertheless, it has been something of an improvement. It may be in the pace of events, given world events, that we will now be on the turn, and we could well be in recession. Now that creates, and you also reminded me, gosh, Was it Gordon Brown who said, no more boom and bust? I can well remember the time when that was a popular phrase, because what we said was that government budgets either provoked a boom, or alternatively they went too far and that provoked a bust. And we all thought, we're all Keynesians now. We've learned how to manage the economy. We won't do that anymore. Well, was it the same things that caused the financial crisis and the banking crisis? Was that not some of the same symptoms, slightly different disease, but was it the same symptoms of something was going to turn, and it happened, and it became a recovery? Now the question is, we in Northern Ireland, in terms of what we're looking for, in terms of the executive and managing the Northern Ireland economy, we're now looking for methods of making sure that whatever happens doesn't turn down too much. But that does take me to a particular point. I've already said to you, I think the difficulties with the executive are having a much more measurable but indirect effect on the economy than the politicians would have us believe, and I think also than most of the business community believe. I mean, let's just test the business community. If you're sitting there running your businesses and you're saying to the government, dear Northern Ireland executive, please run Northern Ireland more efficiently, please have more consistent economic policy, please don't cause instability, fine. Is it enough simply to say that? Have we not reached the stage now where the business community in its different form will have to say, listen, this political process is causing more damage than you realise. Here is our recipe for how we begin to rebuild the economy. Now, we can't get you to sit on the executive and be in agreement, right? We can't, therefore, ensure that we tell you what to do in the Assembly. But we can say, there are certain things that you can do which will start to strengthen the economy. And let me give you the real test, because there's no doubt the Northern Ireland budget is out of kilter, out of gear, heading for a deficit that's unsustainable. The business community is watching that and is saying to the executive, put your house in order. They haven't done it yet. I'm inclined, if I could find other people to support me, I'm inclined to argue we should all be beginning to say things about how you put the Northern Ireland budget in order, because it's spending over $4 billion a year that we wouldn't have if we were part of England. And some of that spending, yes, we don't mind the spending, but it has two consequences. One, it means that as Northern Ireland citizens, we actually pay rather less in terms of taxation or charges than we would for in England. And secondly, when we do spend the extra, we spend it by and large, forgive me for categorising it, we spend it on social causes, not on the economy. Now, I don't want to deny the merits.
But the economy's the number one priority, John, surely.
No, come on. Do you believe that? Okay, I'll speak for myself. The economy is the stated priority. The behaviour is social policy is the priority. Where else would we be in such strength of difficulty in terms of balancing the budget?
Because that's the thing in terms of when we look at disability living allowance, where there's now 1 in 9 people in Northern Ireland claim that. And actually, if you didn't have any welfare reforms and you just project the rates of growth for over the next 4 or 5 years, you would get that down within 8 or 9 years, you would get that down to 1 in 7. And we now have the budget on disability living allowance is set to go through £1 billion in the current financial year.
Now, we have a choice. The budget that we're allowed through the Barnett formula, in my view, it's quite fair. And we could argue up and down a bit. But there is the argument that is coming from some of the political parties that the Barnett formula answer is leaving us a bit short, right? We have a choice. Once we are given the budget, and it may be that there's a question about how much would you want to top it up and going certain things. Once we're given that budget, we have to live within it. And at the moment, I don't know which political leader, which political party in Northern Ireland is giving a strong enough lead to say, and in part that means we must help ourselves. I give you the example of, for example, domestic rates. Domestic rates in Northern Ireland are probably about £500 a family lower than they would be, even in parts of England which are deprived. Now, I don't want to pay extra rates, of course I don't, but do I want to be £500 better off? And does that mean that my regional government won't have that £500 in order to provide the infrastructure, to provide the training, to provide the energy services that will improve our economy? The chicken and egg. We can protect our social standards, but if you protect them by denying your long-term improvements, that's very short-sighted. Now, how do we get that across? First of all, to the business community, so they say, yes, we agree with you. But if the business community agree with us, how do we get that across into the political debate? And the political debate really has to take that on board. We are at the moment working in a form of vacuum if we're not going to be realistic about how we deal with Northern Ireland's finances. We have a budget settlement which by British standards is fair enough. If we think it's not fair enough, we need to make a cogent case, but it's very close to being fair enough, whatever your viewpoint. Then why are we not managing better on it? And why do we then, are we surprised if the economy isn't doing as well as we think it should? Because we haven't put our resources where they could have maximum incentive effects.
Because in my view, the focus in Northern Ireland is too often in terms of more money or increasing public expenditure, as opposed to a focus on outcomes and what you actually get for the money. And I think increasingly we'll see where people are going to have to get used to doing more for less in terms of the government circle, and that's something which isn't going to change. It's something which is evident pretty much every economy around the world. Yes. And I think one of the challenges is going to be at the minute in terms of, while we had at the last global downturn, we then had political confidence in Northern Ireland and stability was ever present. Whereas now we're entering this new era where we have the political difficulties, because even if we had the political stability and agreement and instaurement, the fiscal challenges facing the economy are immense, to say the least. Now we've got the political distraction of all the difficulties in terms of the executive ministers resigning, etc. So that does not paint the ideal conditions for an economy that is going to be competing with other devolved territories within the United Kingdom, the Northern Powerhouse, all of these regions which are eager and enthusiastic to actually grab new fiscal powers and grow their economies.
I'll give you one small example in terms of this. We know that the Department of Health and Social Services is having great difficulty balancing its budget. We need more money for this disease, that hospital, so on and so forth. And the argument is always, we could do so much more if we had more money. Very rarely do we put, for example, the health service to the serious test of, just a minute, you want more money to do more acute services or to care for more of the elderly. How much are you improving your efficiency in the existing way you do things so that you're releasing resources to do it yourselves? Now, we're spending about 10% more per head on health here than they do in Great Britain. Are we really saying we can't solve some problems by improving that management? And of course the short answer is every piece of advice that's come to the health service, including by Sir Liam Donaldson, who sat down and was asked to give us his advice. He gave us his advice and said, you can manage with a better arrangement of acute hospitals. He was misunderstood because people thought what he was saying was you have too many acute hospitals. He was saying we have too many varieties of services in too many hospitals. He was actually asking for more specialisation. But that's the sort of thing. It's sitting there, and by and large, we hope it'll go away. It won't go away.
So in terms of, do you think we've talked about Chinese equity bubbles, we've had a housing bubble in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. Do you think in terms of then in Northern Ireland that we have amongst the electorate, there almost is this reality bubble, and it's continued to get bigger during the downturn? I noticed in the Economist magazine a week or so ago, it was actually saying that half of the EU countries have increased their fees and charges for health over since the financial crisis began, whereas we actually saw in Northern Ireland back in 22 in the midst of the downturn, we were actually not just keeping charges on hold, we were actually reducing them with free prescriptions. So I think in terms of Northern Ireland, what we have is this. We keep talking about this great Scandinavian model where it's got high, which is based on high levels of public expenditure, but also high taxation, whereas Northern Ireland is almost striving for this unique model of high levels of public expending and low taxation, which I'm not sure.
It's impossible even when you put it like that. The short answer is we live in a pretend circumstances. And unfortunately, we don't have political leadership which says, just a minute, I've got to tell you how it is. We've got some difficult choices to make. The leading political parties, we think we know how to make those difficult choices in order to get the best answer, right? And we're going to explain to you that will mean we push against that and we pull money in that way and we have prescription charges or whatever it may be. We do things to be different to pick up the incentive. You and I may grow old still arguing that Northern Ireland could do better. In fact, I'm already doing it. You're catching up.
But you mentioned in terms of social policy versus the economy being the number one priority, and I suppose one of the big sort of battles that we're sort of seeing at the minute is in terms of you would have the pro-economy being the number one priority would be the corporation tax. There's a need for employment creation, and we saw in terms of some of the figures, the labour market figures out yesterday were actually, well, we hear about this, the number claiming unemployment benefit is actually continues to fall, but what we're seeing is in overall employment is falling, economic inactivity is rising, the number of people not looking for work because they're classed as long-term sick has gone up 30% or so in the last 2 years. So we have this welfare issue and this welfare dependency which probably we haven't tried to, that's only ever addressed at a national level. And do you think it's time that now there has to be more from a Northern Ireland economic strategy in terms of actually the political parties and the policy makers at a local level actually targeting issues such as maybe welfare benefit culture, instead of just focusing solely on go for it, get into enterprise, start a business, that there's actually, it's two sides of the same coin?
You tempt me there. I mean, and I could well go down the road which said, yes, it's time for us to use our authority to do things that are different. I pose that statement alongside the argument that essentially, in terms of welfare and social policy, we have lived for today's generation on the basis of parity being the formula. If you have a particular need in terms of health or in terms of employment in Northern Ireland, you will be just as reasonably treated as you would be if you were in Liverpool or Birmingham. We actually, in recent months, indeed a couple of years, we're actually challenging that. I mean, the argument that we won't introduce welfare reform is actually an argument, but people here need something different and more. Now,
because that just, to me, just sets off a distress flare across for Westminster to actually do a full-blown needs assessment and say, okay, for the money that you actually get, how much of it is really needed? Is that something that you think could happen?
We've gone through various cycles when Treasury and London have come close to saying we'll do a needs assessment. And they've always stopped short. I think by and large, our local politicians also stop short. There is a sort of, we know where we are, but it could be a sight worse if we were told you're only going to get this if you can show your needs are bigger or better or greater. And in most cases, that won't be proven. In fact, in most cases, as I say, the average family in Northern Ireland is at least 500, if not 600 pounds a year better off because of the way we have played our tax structure in Northern Ireland under the guidance of the executive. Now, the executive had authority to do it. If I was given the choice, I would tell them, please change your mind. Let's go back to basics and let's talk about helping ourselves to improve ourselves, not supporting ourselves because we feel in terms of welfare terms we're hard done by. I don't subscribe to the view that we're hard done by, but I do subscribe to the view we could do better.
Is it a case of it's actually the messages in terms of how well we are doing are just simply not communicated? Because we have issues such as, for example, I mentioned earlier in terms of disability living allowance, set to breach the £1 billion mark. There's no incentive for us to actually tackle that, given that Westminster picks up the tab. Yet, that £1 billion would equate to half the budget of what we spend to educate our children.
Well, you say Westminster picks up the bill. Westminster is actually saying, in terms of disability, just a minute, we would like to reshape the social security system so that we don't just pick up an ever-increasing bill, and that the system that's now being gradually brought in Great Britain, based on universal credit and a complete change in the welfare base, is going to be one that means that probably a third of people in Northern Ireland will be slightly better off, a third will be no worse off, and a third will actually lose out. Things like welfare payments caps and other stringencies. Now, the short answer is, when you look at the studies that have been done at this, I would argue this is not a form of Tory cut that is designed to hurt. That's the way to be seen by some people. It is a form of reshaping which has some social justification, and it would actually help the economy as well. Let's do it.
So overall, I suppose, in terms of sum up we've had in terms of this week, manufacturing sector appears to be slowing down, particularly in terms of, you look at the third quarter with the Purchasing and Managers Index. Service sector isn't faring too bad, but we're still lagging behind the UK. Mm-hmm. Employment is starting to fall, economic inactivity is rising, and political confidence, I suppose at the minute you would argue, is falling given the ongoing political difficulties that we face, and interest rates can only go one way, and that's up.
Watch this space.
So we're not going to have the monetary policy stimulus or the ability to cut rates that we had in 2009. Rates are going to start increasing probably potentially from next year, and that is going to be the difficult environment that Northern Ireland faces.
Difficult environment with the danger that we're heading into another type of recession in which the management of that recession, both at London or United Kingdom level and Belfast or Stormont level, now needs to have a complete relook at policy to make sure we've actually thought through what we're doing.